The air at the Polk County Fair in the summer of '71 was thick with the smell of spun sugar, grilled onions, and fresh-cut hay. But for Frank Miller, the only scent that mattered was the intoxicating perfume of new paint and curing rubber coming off the John Deere display. There it sat, gleaming under the August sun like a green and yellow idol, a brand new 4320, its diesel engine a promise of raw power, its sound guard cab a vision of space-age comfort. Frank ran a calloused hand over the massive rear tire, the deep treads still holding dust from the factory floor. He'd been farming his father's 320 acres for 10 years now, ever since the old man's heart gave out behind the wheel of their Farmall M. His main workhorse was a 1962 John Deere Forte 110, a tractor he'd bought used 5 years back and had just made the final payment on last fall. It was a good machine, honest and strong, but it didn't have the turbocharged guts of this new 4320. It didn't have the enclosed cab with air conditioning and a radio. On hot days, Frank ate dust for 12 hours straight. On cold days, the winter wind cut right through his canvas coat. "Dreamin', Miller?" The voice, slick with condescension, cut through his reverence. Frank didn't have to turn around. He knew that tone. Dale Jensen, his neighbor to the west. Dale's shadow fell over the tractor, a big, confident shape that seemed to block out the sun. "Just lookin', Dale," Frank said, straightening up and wiping his hand on his jeans. "Lookin's for kids at a candy store window. A man takes what he wants," Dale said, slapping the tractor's fender with a proprietary thud. "Just signed the papers on her this morning. She'll be delivered Tuesday." Frank felt a familiar knot tighten in his gut. It was a mix of envy and something else, something like caution. Dale had taken over his father-in-law's farm 3 years ago and had been on a buying spree ever since. He'd bought the quarter section south of his place last year and was already talking about buying the Abernathy 80 when the old man finally retired. All of it, Frank knew, was on the bank's dime. "She's a fine machine," Frank admitted, his voice low. "A lot of tractor." "The best," Dale corrected him, puffing out his chest. He was wearing a brand new pair of cowboy boots and a pearl snap shirt that hadn't seen a lick of real work. "You know, Frank, I saw you chugging along on that old 4010 of yours last spring, smoking like a freight train. You're holding yourself back with that junk." "She's paid for," Frank said simply. The words felt solid and heavy in his mouth, a comfort. "Does the job." Dale let out a short, barking laugh. A couple of other farmers nearby turned to look. "Does the job. Frank, this ain't 1950 anymore. The bank is practically giving money away. 2% interest. You gotta spend money to make money. Leverage, they call it. You could trade in that old relic, get one of these, and probably pull a 6-bottom plow instead of that little 4-bottom you got. You'd be done with your spring tillage in half the time." Frank thought of his 4-bottom John Deere plow. It was old, sure, but he'd re-welded the frame himself and put new shares on it every season. It tracked straight and true. "My 4010 pulls the 4-bottom just fine. And I sleep at night, Dale. I don't lie awake wondering what happens if corn drops 50 cents a bushel." Dale shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face that was more insulting than any anger. "That's small-time thinking. You gotta think bigger. Expand, modernize. You're gonna get left in the dust, my friend. Mark my words. In 5 years, guys like me will be farming your land after the bank takes it from you." The threat hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Frank's hands curled into fists at his sides. He thought of his father, a man who hated debt more than he hated bindweed. "Buy what you can afford, son," he'd always said. "The banker ain't your friend. He's just a fellow who rents you an umbrella and asks for it back the minute it starts to rain." Frank looked from Dale's smug face to the gleaming green tractor. He could almost feel the phantom weight of a payment book in his pocket, a chain linking him to the bank for years to come. He saw the appeal, the raw, seductive power of it. But he also saw the risk, a chasm of uncertainty that Dale was leaping into with a smile on his face. "I'll stick with what I own," Frank said, his voice firm. He turned and started to walk away. "Your funeral?" Dale called after him. "Don't come crying to me when that old dear of yours throws a rod in the middle of planting." Frank didn't look back. He just kept walking, the laughter of Dale and the other farmers prickling the back of his neck. He walked past the Ferris wheel, past the livestock barns, and didn't stop until he was standing by his dusty 1965 Ford F-100 pickup. He leaned against the fender, the metal warm from the sun, and took a deep breath. The smell of diesel and debt from the new 4320 seemed to follow him, a ghost of a future he wanted no part of. Now, before we go any further into this story, I want to ask you all something. Many of you listening have probably been in Frank's shoes, or maybe you saw things more like Dale. Maybe you remember your own father or grandfather standing at that same crossroads. So I want you to head down to the comments right now and tell me, what was the first piece of heavy iron you ever truly called your own? Was it a Farmall Cub your dad gave you? A Ford 8N you saved up for? Or maybe it was a brand new machine you took a loan out for, believing in the future. Let me know what you think is the smarter path, staying debt-free with old iron, or leveraging up with new equipment to chase the boom times. I'm curious to read what you all have to say. The following spring of '72, the frost broke early. The ground was firming up nicely, and Frank was itching to get in the fields. He'd spent the winter tuning up the 40-10, changing the oil, replacing the fuel filters, and greasing every zerk he could find. The 6-cylinder diesel engine fired up with a satisfying roar on the first try, settling into that iconic John Deere rhythm that was music to a farmer's ears. He was halfway through dissing his first 40-acre field when he smelled it, a faint, acrid scent of hot oil. He scanned his gauges. Everything looked normal. Temperature was steady, oil pressure was good. He kept going, convincing himself it was just the wind carrying a smell from somewhere else. But then he saw it, a dark, wet sheen coating the side of the transmission housing right below the hydraulic pump. He swore under his breath and throttled down, letting the big diesel idle as he climbed off to inspect the damage. It wasn't a gusher, but it was a steady, serious drip. Hydraulic fluid, the lifeblood of the tractor, was weeping from the main pump gasket. Every drip that hit the hot metal sizzled and sent up a wisp of foul-smelling smoke. He knew right away this wasn't a field repair. Back at the machine shed, the real work began. The hydraulic pump on a 40-10 is buried deep in the tractor's guts, a heavy, cast-iron beast bolted directly to the transmission. To get to it, he first had to drain all 12 gallons of hydraulic fluid, a messy, smelly job. Then came the fuel tank, which sat right over the top. He disconnected the fuel lines, unbolted the heavy steel straps, and wrestled the half-full tank off the tractor, sloshing diesel onto the concrete floor. By midday, he had a clear shot at the pump. He spent the next hour meticulously disconnecting the high-pressure steel lines, each one fastened with a fitting that seemed to have been tightened by a giant. His knuckles were scraped raw, and a film of greasy dirt and hydraulic fluid coated his arms up to the elbows. Finally, he unbolted the pump itself. The thing weighed a good 70 pounds, and he had to grunt and strain to lower the awkward chunk of iron to the floor without dropping it. He carried it over to his workbench and began the careful surgery of disassembly. The problem was immediately obvious. The main body gasket, a thin piece of treated paper, had become brittle with age and heat and had failed along one edge. A simple $2 part had brought his entire planting operation to a standstill. The trouble was, he didn't have one. He cleaned the grease off his hands as best he could with a gasoline-soaked rag and went inside to call the John Deere dealer over in Clarksville, 40 miles away. "Yeah, we got the gasket kit for a 4010 pump," said the parts man, a young kid whose voice hadn't finished changing. "But we ain't got a driver coming out your way till Friday." Friday. It was Tuesday. The weather forecast was calling for heavy rain starting Thursday night. Frank's jaw tightened. "I'll come and get it." The 80-mile round trip in his old pickup ate up the rest of the afternoon. While he was in town, he saw Dale Jensen's brand-new Ford F-250 parked outside the bank. Dale was farming, expanding, making money. Frank was chasing parts. He got back to the farm just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. He worked by the single bare bulb hanging from the rafters of the shed, his hand steady and practiced as he scraped the old gasket material off the pump housing, carefully fitted the new one, and began the long, arduous process of putting it all back together. It was nearly 10 o'clock when he finally tightened the last bolt on the fuel tank. He was exhausted. His back ached, and he smelled like a refinery. As he was filling the tractor with fresh hydraulic fluid, he heard the rumble of a diesel engine coming down the county road. Headlights swept across his farmstead, slowing as they approached. It was Dale in his new 4320, the lights on his cab illuminating the field he had just finished planting across the road. Dale stopped his tractor right in the middle of the road. The quiet hum of his engine and the soft glow from his air-conditioned cab were a world away from Frank's greasy, dimly lit shed. Dale leaned out the window, a silhouette against the modern dashboard. "Having some trouble there, Miller?" he shouted, his voice dripping with mock concern. Frank didn't answer. He just kept pouring the 5-gallon bucket of High-Guard fluid, the glugging sound loud in the quiet night. "You know," Dale continued, "I finished my last 80 acres right after supper. This new machine, she just eats up the ground. Didn't have a single problem all day." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "Still think that old junk is worth it?" Frank slowly set the empty bucket down. He looked at his hands, black with grease and grime. He looked at his 4010, its guts laid bare and now slowly being put back together. Then he looked across the road at Dale, sitting in his climate-controlled cab, clean and comfortable. For a fleeting moment, a wave of doubt washed over him. Maybe Dale was right. Maybe he was just a stubborn fool, clinging to the past while the world moved on without him. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands. "She'll be ready to run by sunup," he called back, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "And she'll still be mine." Dale just chuckled and shook his head. He put the 4320 in gear, and with a powerful roar, he drove off into the night, leaving Frank alone with the smell of oil and the weight of his own convictions. The rain started an hour later, a day and a half early. It turned his undissed fields into a sea of mud, ensuring he wouldn't get back to planting for at least a week. The delay would cost him, not just in seed and fuel for replanting the washed-out spots, but in yield. Every day you plant corn past the first week of May, you lose bushels. It was a cold, hard fact of farming, and that year it was a lesson he was learning the hard way. The next couple of years were a blur of hard work and tight margins. But then, in 1973, everything changed. The world woke up one morning and discovered it was hungry. The Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly arranged to buy nearly a quarter of the entire U.S. grain crop. The news, when it finally broke, sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been hovering around $1.50 a bushel, shot past $3. Soybeans went from $3 to over $10. It was a boom the likes of which no one had ever seen. For Dale Jensen, it was like winning the lottery. He had gone all in on corn that year, planting fence row to fence row. With his big, efficient equipment, he brought in a massive harvest and sold it at the peak of the market. The money flowed in like a river. Before the snow fell that winter, he had bought the 160 acres from Old Man Abernathy, paying cash for the down payment and getting another big loan from the bank for the rest. His spending didn't stop there. He traded his year-old 4320 for a brand-new John Deere 4630, a monster of a tractor with 150 horsepower. To go with it, he bought a new 6-row planter and a 20-foot field cultivator. His biggest purchase, though, was a gleaming John Deere 7700 turbo combine. It was the largest, most advanced combine on the market, complete with a grain monitor and hydrostatic drive. He was the first farmer in the county to own one, and he made sure everyone knew it. He'd drive it down the main highway instead of the back roads, its massive grain head taking up more than a full lane, daring anyone to get in his way. Dale became the poster boy for the new age of farming. He bought his wife a brand-new, boat-sized Chrysler New Yorker, and he started talking about building a new house up on the hill overlooking his land. At the co-op and the diner in town, he was treated like a prophet. The other farmers, their pockets also flush with unexpected cash, looked at him with admiration. He was proof that taking risks, leveraging debt, and embracing the new technology was the only way to farm. Frank had a good year, too. In fact, it was the best year of his life. The high prices meant he cleared more profit off his 320 acres than his father had in 5 years combined. Mary, his wife, started talking about maybe getting a new dishwasher, maybe even taking a vacation down to Florida to see her sister. But Frank was cautious. The boom felt fragile to him, like a soap bubble that could pop at any moment. He remembered his father's stories of the Depression, of neighbors who had lost everything because they'd overextended themselves in the good times of the 1920s. Instead of buying new iron, Frank took his windfall and drove into town to see Mr. Harrison at the Polk County Savings and Loan. He walked up to the teller and paid off the last 7 years of his farm mortgage in a single lump sum. The teller, a young woman named Betty, stared at the check, her eyes wide. Mr. Harrison himself came out of his office to shake Frank's hand. "Congratulations, Frank," the banker said, his smile looking a little strained. "It's not every day we see a man burn his mortgage papers anymore." "Feels good to own it outright," Frank said. With the rest of the money, he made practical, careful investments. He paid a crew to put a new steel roof on the big barn. He bought a used but solid John Deere Vetteltinen 54 bottom plow, one model newer than his old one, from an estate auction. He replaced the worn-out tires on the 4010. The bulk of the money he put into U.S. savings bonds, tucking them away in his safe deposit box. He and Mary still drove their old Ford pickup, and the old Maytag dishwasher continued to rattle away in their kitchen. His conservatism did not go unnoticed. One Saturday morning at the corner cafe, the unofficial headquarters for the county's farmers, Frank was nursing a cup of coffee when Dale Jensen came in with a few of his followers. Dale was holding court, loudly describing the heated floors he was planning for his new machine shed. He spotted Frank sitting alone in a booth and sauntered over. "Miller," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Heard you paid off the old homestead. Guess you're planning on retiring." "Not planning on it," Frank said quietly, stirring his coffee. "Well, you sure ain't planning on expanding," Dale shot back, a smirk on his face. A man gets a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with prices like these, a chance to really build something. And what do? You squirrel it away like some old woman hiding cash in a mattress. Some fellas are just happy staying small. Can't see the opportunity when it's smacking 'em in the face. A few of the other farmers chuckled. Frank could feel their eyes on him. He was no longer just old-fashioned. He was a fool, a man without vision, a failure in the face of incredible success. He just looked down at his coffee cup, the ceramic warm in his hands. He didn't have an answer for them, not one they would understand. A few weeks later, Frank had to go back to the bank to sign the final release papers for his mortgage. As he was leaving Mr. Harrison's office, the banker's phone rang. Frank paused at the door to say his goodbyes, but Harrison was already deep in conversation, his back to the room. "I understand the prime rate is jumping, Jim," Harrison said into the receiver, his voice tight with a tension Frank hadn't heard before. "But these variable rate loans, we've got half the county signed up. If rates go to 10, 12%, they're going to get slaughtered." There was a pause. Frank stood frozen, the doorknob cold in his hand. I know. Land values are high," Harrison continued, pinching the bridge of his nose. "But they can't stay this high forever. We've got guys like Jensen leveraged to the hilt. He's got $750,000 on the books with us. It's all based on $5 corn. If that changes..." Frank didn't wait to hear the rest. He quietly closed the door and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The words echoed in his head. Variable rates, prime jumping, leveraged to the hilt. A cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach. Just then, he heard a familiar roar. He looked down the highway and saw it. Dale's massive 7700 combine, heading out to another newly acquired field. It gleamed in the sun, an unstoppable green monster, a symbol of progress and prosperity. But to Frank, it suddenly looked different. It looked like a tombstone, leaving a long, dark trail of diesel smoke and debt in its wake. The good times felt like they were running on borrowed time, and Frank had a sinking feeling that the bill was about to come due. The boom years burned hot and fast, and then, in the summer of '78, the sky simply forgot how to rain. Day after day, a merciless sun beat down from a hazy white sky. The corn leaves curled in on themselves by mid-morning, a thirsty, desperate gesture. The ground, once rich and black, baked to the color of ash and cracked open in a spiderweb of fissures deep enough to swallow a wrench. The air that blew across the fields was not a breeze, but a blast from a furnace, carrying the scent of dust and dying crops. Frank's 4010, chugging along as he cultivated his soybeans for the third time to conserve what little moisture was left, ran hot. The temperature needle crept steadily toward the red, and he had to stop every few hours to let it cool, sitting in the sliver of shade cast by a rear tire, drinking lukewarm water from a thermos. Dale's big 4630, with its powerful cooling system and air-conditioned cab, ran all day without complaint, but the technology couldn't make it rain. From his own fields, Frank could see Dale's corn, planted thick to chase those record yields, suffering the worst. The stalks were stunted, the leaves fired yellow halfway to the top. The drought broke in late August, not with gentle soaking showers but with a biblical fury. Clouds the color of a deep bruise boiled up on the western horizon one afternoon. Frank saw it coming and raced to get the last of his hay bales into the barn. The wind hit first, a solid wall that flattened the corn and tore shingles from the roof of the machine shed. Then came the hail, first the size of peas, then marbles, then golf balls, hammering the steel roof of his barn with a deafening roar that sounded like the end of the world. In 15 minutes, it was over. The sun came back out, glinting off a landscape of shredded leaves and battered, broken stalks. Harvest that year was a grim affair. Frank's old John Deere 55 combine, a machine he'd bought at an auction for a few $100s and rebuilt himself, clattered its way through his thin, disappointing fields. The yield monitor was the sound the grain made hitting the bottom of the empty hopper. One afternoon, a drive belt for the main separator snapped. It was a common failure on the old machine. Frank shut it down, climbed into the greasy guts of the combine with a spare belt he always carried and 2 wrenches, and had it running again in under an hour. 2 days later, he saw the John Deere dealer's service truck parked at the end of Dale Jensen's lane. Dale's massive 7700 turbo was sitting silent in the middle of a field, its huge grain head tilted at a sad angle. Frank learned what happened later at the co-op. A high-pitched whine had started in the cab, followed by a lurch, and then nothing. The hydrostatic transmission, a complex marvel of high-pressure hydraulic pumps and motors that propelled the 15-ton machine, had failed catastrophically. It wasn't a belt or a bearing a man could change himself. It was a sealed unit, a piece of sophisticated engineering that required a specialist and a $4,000 bill to fix. Dale lost 3 precious days of harvest, waiting for the parts and the mechanic. The final blow came not from the sky or from a broken machine, but from a voice on the radio. In early 1980, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the US government announced a grain embargo. The market, which had been the foundation of the farming boom, collapsed overnight. Corn prices plunged from over $3 back down to $2. Land values, which had been inflated to impossible heights by the good times, began a terrifying, stomach-churning slide. Suddenly, Dale Jensen wasn't a visionary anymore. He was a man standing on a cliff edge as the ground crumbled beneath his feet. He had nearly 1,000 acres, most of it bought at peak prices, with money borrowed at variable interest rates. His new house, half finished on the hill, was a monument to a future that had just been cancelled. The payments on his fleet of new green machinery, which had seemed so manageable when corn was high, were now a crushing, insurmountable weight. The first crack in his empire wasn't a sound you could hear, but a silence. The construction on his new house stopped. The half-framed walls stood stark against the winter sky, a skeleton of a dead dream. The early 1980s descended on the heartland like a plague. The news on the radio was a constant dirge of falling prices and rising interest rates. To combat nationwide inflation, the Federal Reserve jacked up the prime rate, and the variable rate loans that men like Dale had signed so eagerly in the 70s became instruments of torture. Interest rates climbed from the single digits to 12%, then 15%, then an unthinkable 21%. A loan payment that had been $3,000 a month became $7,000. It was like trying to breathe with a python wrapped around your chest. Foreclosure notices, printed on grim-colored paper, started appearing tacked to the doors of the county courthouse. Farm auctions became a weekly spectacle, grim gatherings where neighbors watched silently as a family's life and legacy were sold off piece by piece to strangers. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant was the soundtrack to the collapse. Frank survived. He had no debt. His mortgage was burned. His equipment was his own. The low grain prices hurt, but they didn't kill him. He wasn't making payments to the bank. He was only paying for his fuel, seed, and fertilizer. He and Mary lived simply. They grew a huge garden, canned their own vegetables, and patched their clothes instead of buying new ones. His old 4010 tractor became a symbol of his survival. While newer, more powerful tractors were being repossessed, the 4010 kept running. When a water pump failed, Frank bought a rebuild kit for $30 and fixed it himself on his workbench. When the starter began to grind, he took it apart, cleaned the contacts, and put it back together. He was a farmer, but he was also a mechanic, a welder, and a scavenger. His self-reliance was his salvation. Dale Jensen's end came in the spring of '84. Frank saw the auction announcement in the local paper, a full page listing every tool, every tractor, every acre Dale owned. The day of the auction was cold and grey, with a wind that cut to the bone. The farmstead was crowded with trucks and cars. Frank parked his old Ford down the road and walked up the lane, a knot in his stomach. It was a gut-wrenching sight. Dale's magnificent machines, the 4630 tractor and the 17700 combine, which had once been symbols of his power and vision, were now lined up in a row, caked with mud and tagged with lot numbers. They looked tired and defeated. Frank saw Dale standing by the back door of the house, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. His wife stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly, staring at nothing. The pearl-snap shirts and fancy boots were gone. Dale was wearing worn-out overalls and scuffed work boots, looking like just another farmer who had lost the fight. The auctioneer started with the small items from the machine shed: wrenches, drills, welders. Then he moved to the equipment. Frank watched as the 4630, a tractor that had cost Dale nearly $40,000, was sold for $12,000. The 7700 combine, a $100,000 machine, went for less than a quarter of that. The buyers were mostly from out of state, hard-faced men who smelled a bargain and showed no emotion. They were picking over the bones of Dale's dream. Finally, the auctioneer turned to the land. It was sold in parcels. The Abernathy 160, the quarter section to the south. Each piece went for a fraction of what Dale had paid for it just a few years before. The last parcel to be sold was the original 80 acres, the piece that held the house, the barns, and the machine shed. The place Dale's wife had grown up. The bidding was slow. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's home. Mr. Harrison from the bank stood with his arms crossed, his face grim, ensuring the price was high enough to cover at least some of the note. The bidding stalled at a low number. Frank saw the look of utter despair on the faces of Dale and his wife. He thought of that day at the fair, the smug confidence, the condescending laugh. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph. He just felt a profound sadness. He thought of his father's words about the banker and the umbrella. He thought of his own paid-for land, his financial freedom that felt more valuable than ever in that moment. He took a deep breath. He had never intended to do this, but in that instant, he knew he had to. He raised his hand. The auctioneer's eyes locked onto him. "I have a new bid," he barked. A few heads turned. Frank kept his hand up, his gaze fixed on the auctioneer, avoiding eye contact with Dale. Another man bid against him once, then twice. Frank just kept bidding, his voice calm and steady. Finally, the other man shook his head and dropped out. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the cold air. "To Frank Miller." A murmur went through the crowd. Frank lowered his hand and walked toward the clerk's table to sign the papers, feeling the weight of every eye in the crowd on his back. He had just bought his neighbor's home. A week later, after the shock had settled, Frank drove his pickup down the lane to Dale's house. He found Dale loading the last of their personal belongings into a small U-Haul trailer hitched to his wife's old station wagon. The place felt empty, haunted. Dale didn't look up as Frank approached. He just kept working, his movements stiff with anger and shame. "Came to gloat, Miller?" Dale said without turning around, his voice rough. "Come to see the big shot get his comeuppance?" "No, Dale," Frank said quietly. "I didn't." Dale finally stopped and turned, his eyes red-rimmed. "Then what do you want? You got the farm. You got everything. What more is there? Frank looked at the house, the barn, the familiar landscape. I'm not a landlord, Dale. I'm a farmer. This is too much land for me to handle on my own. He paused, letting the words sink in. I need a hired hand, someone who knows this ground better than anyone. Dale stared at him, his mouth slightly open. He looked from Frank to the house, then back to Frank, his mind struggling to process the offer. Disbelief, suspicion, and a tiny flickering spark of hope warred in his eyes. You want to hire me? Dale stammered. To work my own farm? It's my farm now, Frank corrected him gently, but without malice. But it's your home. The house is part of the deal. You and your family can stay. I'll pay you a fair wage. We'll work the land together. The fight went out of Dale's shoulders. His whole body seemed to sag with a relief so profound it was almost painful to watch. He leaned against the trailer, and for the first time, Frank saw not a rival, not a prophet of a false gospel, but just a man. A broken man who had lost his way and was now being offered a map back home. Dale looked down at his boots, unable to meet Frank's eyes. Why? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. After everything I said, why would you do this? Frank thought for a long moment. He looked out over the fields, the same fields he'd looked at his whole life. Because we're neighbors, he said simply. And around here, that's still supposed to mean something. Life settled into a new rhythm. Dale Jensen, humbled and quiet, proved to be a good and tireless worker. He knew the land, its moods and its needs, and he worked with a quiet desperation, as if trying to atone for his past hubris. The flashy new equipment was gone, replaced by Frank's older, paid-for iron. Dale, who had once mocked the old 4010, now found himself behind its wheel, cultivating the same fields he had once raced across in his air-conditioned cab. There was a quiet irony in it that was not lost on either man. The community's perspective shifted. At the corner cafe, the talk was no longer of expansion and leverage. It was of survival. The men who had once laughed at Frank now sought his counsel, asking him how he'd managed to weather the storm. Frank never gloated. He'd just sip his coffee and say, I just tried to remember what my father taught me. You don't bet the farm because you only have one. He became an elder statesman, his quiet wisdom respected far more than Dale's loud confidence had ever been. Years passed. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip. Prices stabilized, and a cautious optimism returned to the heartland. Frank and Dale worked side by side, their partnership solidifying into a genuine friendship, born from shared work and mutual respect. Frank never treated Dale as anything less than an equal, and Dale, in turn, never forgot the act of grace that had saved him from utter ruin. One crisp fall afternoon in the late 1980s, Frank was in the machine shed, teaching his own 16-year-old son, Michael, how to adjust the valves on the 4010's diesel engine. The tractor, now nearly 30 years old, was a testament to durability. Its green paint faded and worn, its metal bearing the scars of thousands of hours of hard work. You see this engine, Mike? Frank said, pointing with a greasy wrench. It's simple, it's strong. There's no computer, no fancy electronics. Everything in here you can understand. You can fix it with your own 2 hands. Michael, a boy with his father's quiet intensity, nodded as he carefully tightened a nut. Some of the kids at school, their dads have new tractors with computers that tell you everything. Frank wiped his hands on a red rag, the smell of diesel and steel thick in the air. He looked at the old tractor, then out the open door of the shed, across the fields that stretched to the horizon, a patchwork of gold and brown under the autumn sun. "Those new tractors are fine machines," he said. "They'll do a lot of work in a hurry. But they come with a payment book, and that payment book is a chain. It links you to the bank, to the markets, to 100 things you can't control." This old girl, he patted the tractor's fender with a fondness usually reserved for a trusted old horse. "She doesn't send you a bill every month. She asks for fuel and oil, and a little bit of your time. In return, she gives you freedom." He put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Farming isn't about getting rich, son. It's about staying. It's about holding on to the land. It's about ending the year with your name, and not the bank's, on the mailbox. Never forget that." Just then, they heard the rumble of another tractor. It was Dale, bringing in the last load of soybeans from the far field on an old, beat-up gravity wagon. He was driving a John Deere 3020, a smaller tractor Frank had bought at another auction. Dale pulled up to the grain auger, gave a slight wave to Frank and Michael, and got to work. He looked older, his face lined with the hard lessons he had learned. But he looked content. He was home. Frank watched him for a moment, then turned back to his son and the old 4010. The setting sun cast long shadows across the concrete floor of the shed, illuminating the faithful green tractor in a warm, golden light. It stood there, not as a relic of the past, but as an anchor, a promise. It was the sound of its iconic two-cylinder-style engine that had echoed through Frank's life, a steady, reliable rhythm of work, of survival, and of a quiet, hard-won peace. It was the sound of a legacy, ready to be passed on,